Welcome to the public meeting for the San Antonio Airport System Strategic Development Plan. We appreciate your taking the time to be with us for this meeting, one of 3 identical public meetings for the Strategic Development Plan, or SDP, this week. My name is Gretchen Roofs, and I am the consulting team's Deputy Project Manager for Stakeholder Engagement for the SDP, and I will be your moderator for today's meeting. A few housekeeping items. Except for the presenters and the panelists, all participants' microphones and cameras will not be turned on and will remain so during the entire meeting. So if you're here with us as a participant and your dog barks or your phone rings, don't worry, no one else will hear those things. If you would like to view the meeting at a later date, you can go to the SDP website at sanantonio.gov/SATfuture and watch the recorded version of this meeting, which will be posted on the website by February 15th. If you have joined this meeting by telephone only, you can email satfuture@sanantonio.gov to ask questions, make comments, or request a printed copy of today's presentation. As a reminder, this is a Strategic Development Plan public meeting during which we will update you on the status of the airport planning alternatives that are being considered to accommodate growth at the San Antonio International Airport over the next 20 years. Towards the end of the meeting, we will also be providing information on the new development principles related to the sense of place for the airport. If you are here because you would like to hear about the update to the noise exposure map, often referred to as NEM, please note that the NEM workshops are scheduled for next week on February 16th, 17th, 18th, and 22nd. We will not be talking about the noise exposure map update at this meeting. If you would like more information about next week's NEM meetings, the airport's noise hotline phone and email address are posted on your screen. Today's meeting is expected to run about 2 hours, and several question and answer segments are included in the agenda. At the conclusion of the formal presentation about the SDP, we will answer your questions in the order they are received, starting with the questions that were submitted prior to the meeting. To submit a question during the Strategic Development Plan meeting, please type your question into the Q&A feature on your screen. Finally, if you are having trouble viewing the meeting or hearing the speakers or presentations, please type in your request for help into the Q&A feature on your screen, and one of our technical support team members will assist you. Now we will hear a welcome from the Director of Airports for the San Antonio Airport System, Jesus Saenz, who will provide some opening remarks before we start the SDP presentation.
On behalf of the San Antonio Airport System, welcome to our Strategic Development Plan public meeting. We are excited to have you with us for this public meeting, and we have some great information to share with you. First, we'll provide an update to you about the Strategic Development Plan, which many of you have been involved in over the past couple of years. We're also going to give you a sneak preview of our development principles related to our commitment to bringing more of a sense of place to our terminals. Before we begin, however, I'd like to give you a few updates about what's going on at the airport these days. The San Antonio International Airport has continued to outpace the national average in terms of passengers. We are currently at 35% of 2019 levels of passengers. We had service to 22 nonstop destinations in December, compared to 41 in 2019, with a strong return of service to Mexico, including recently announced Sun Country Airlines nonstop service to Cancun International Airport. Mexico service is pretty much back to where it was last year, so we are very fortunate in that regard. We have 62% of our concessions operating, and expect to have 2 to 3 additional concepts, including Boss Bagel and Sip Brew and Market, opening soon. Other concessionaires that have opened in the past year include Smoke Shack, Local Coffee, and the Spur Store. I think people will be happy to know that there is now a food service option in the pre-security area of Terminal B, outside of the consolidated car rental facility. It's a Dunkin' Donuts Express counter, open from 4 a.m. to 2 p.m. We know that many of you in recent strategic development plan surveys requested access to food and beverages in the pre-security area of the airport, and we want you to know that we heard you. Our team has been very focused on responding to the challenges created by the COVID-19 virus. One of our COVID-19 responses involved the purchase of a robot that disinfects surfaces around jet bridges, gate areas, counters, baggage claims, restrooms, and other high traffic areas. We were proud to partner with San Antonio-based Xenix to introduce this germ zapping technology to the airport. So let's get on with our meeting. Again, 2 topics today: an update to the strategic development plan and a preview of a new development guidelines project we've started to bring sense of place to all future airport undertakings. While we would love to be with you in person to talk about our strategic development plan and our efforts related to a more defined sense of place, we're delighted to see that our SDP meeting attendance is at an all-time high. We believe the virtual nature of these meetings is making them more accessible to our community than in-person meetings are. And for that, we are grateful. Thank you for being here and for your interest in the future of the San Antonio airport system. We look forward to hearing your questions and your thoughts.
Our thanks to Jesus Saenz for that very nice welcome. David Robbins, who is Chief Development Officer for the San Antonio Airport System, recently joined the airport's executive team. David has over 22 years of experience in aviation public works, most recently at the Chicago Department of Aviation, and he would like to say a few words. David?
Thank you, Gretchen. I'm just going to echo the words of who signed and welcoming everyone, and let you know that I'm pleased to join with you, our stakeholders, neighbors, team members, in forming our strategic development plan. It's widely known that San Antonio is among the fastest growing cities in America and is really ahead of the curve in addressing the best ways to accommodate the expected long-term growth and expansion needs of the airport and the region. So you, our community members, our neighbors and stakeholders are very important to the SDP and to the future San Antonio International Airport. I'd like to meet you all in person, but of course, in the season of COVID, this we'll have to do. And I'm very pleased to be here to express our thanks to you for being here and for your interest in the strategic development plan. That's all I have to say, Ms. Gretchen. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for your comments. John Van Woensel is the consulting team's project manager for the San Antonio Airport System Strategic Development Plan. He is Vice President and National Aviation Planning Manager for WSP. John will present the recap of the SDP's progress to date and the status of the airport planning alternatives being considered to accommodate growth at the San Antonio International Airport over the next 20 years. John?
Thank you, Gretchen. Good afternoon. So let's dive right into the presentation. So on the agenda for today, we're going to first give you a bit of an overview as to where we are in the SDP process, which has been going on for a while. We're going to kind of recap some of the work we've already done, and some of you may have been part of past efforts. Then we'll tell you where we are with the current ongoing work, and then we'll have a Q&A session. And we'll say SDP a couple of times throughout this, and of course we mean Strategic Development Plan. First, the overview of where we are and a recap. This is a schedule that shows major ongoing tasks and sort of the completion later this year. all on one chart. We'll come back to this a bit later. There's a lot of information here. What is key is that today we're going to be presenting the airfield plan to you. It's essentially done. Next will be the terminal, landside, and then other tenant support facilities at the airport. You'll see those longer bars there. After that's done, we'll be looking at how to phase projects into being as they're justified and needed, how to pay for them, and the financial feasibility of them. When we have all that figured out, there'll be another round of public workshops, as you can see there on the blue arrow. And we'll be reporting back in the August, September timeframe before the plan, the complete plan goes before council in September. So the recap of the earlier work done, and some of you may have seen this at the open house or the other meetings we had in 2018, including the council presentation at the end of October. This is not an airport plan. What this is a test of whether the airport can meet the long-term needs of the region. There was an ongoing concern, and this goes back decades, but had really become more intense in recent years, where people were concerned about the airport's ability to meet the long-term needs of the airport. Would it start constraining the region's air travel needs? So we said, in order to really put this question to bed, we have to have a really thorough answer and look at data. So the approach was, let's go out 50 years instead of 20 or 30 or 40. Let's take not just projected demand for aviation as we expected, but let's do an aggressive scenario. So that's a double exaggeration. And then the third thing we did is we said, let's assume all facilities you might need come online or built early, not kind of when they're justified. So if you do those three things, you've really exaggerated everything. And if you can make that fit for 50 years, you know whether the site's good or not. So what you see here is an actual slide from 2018. This cloud is not a runway. It's not a specific runway. What this is meant to show is where a whole host of runways might go, because at this point, we're looking at 50 years, and it could be closely spaced runway, could be widely spaced runway more toward the top end of the cloud. Doesn't matter. It would fit in the case of the widely spaced runway with some acquisition. Same with the terminal. We said in the green cloud there, where the two colors overlap, that's the existing terminals A and B. We said, what if in this exaggerated scenario we need up to 63 gates? What kind of footprint is that? Where would that fit? So you see two of the locations here. We also looked at a third one in the cloud in between any future potential runway layout. But you can see here that the blue or the yellow cloud would represent sort of the 50-year aggressive footprint. You'd have to obviously relocate some tenants with the north cloud. And the south cloud would only be possible once the crosswind runway 422 goes away. But there's options. And so whichever one it might be, there are options to make this work. That's really all we were trying to answer in phase one. And I know that this exhibit is sometimes people think this was the plan, but this was just a test of the site. This next slide, the will it fit finding slide, also came from those meetings we shared with everybody and council. And basically the answer to the will it fit question was yes, but governmental approvals would be needed before you implemented everything. Some amount of land acquisition may be necessary depending on what exact scenario you go with. So that question was settled in late 2018. And then in 2019, we said, okay, now let's focus on the existing airport and study it and see what do we need, what is reasonable, what is not exaggerated. And so we call that phase two because it was a contract amendment and it had a totally different focus. What is different about it is now we're looking at the most likely growth. This is a forecast scenario that FAA reviewed and approved. We also looked at a 20-year planning horizon, which is a little bit more overseeable than 50 years, and also typical for master planning, airport master planning purposes. And also, instead of planning for facilities to come online early, we're looking at facilities, when they're actually justified by demand, when they're needed. So those are some pretty dramatic changes. So we changed gears, and that's what we're now looking at in phase two. So on the next slide, you'll see that we're looking at the airfield first, and why becomes obvious when you see this existing airfield. And we made the grass greener than it actually is, so you can see it better. But you can see that the vast majority of the airport property is made up of the airfield. The runways have lots of restrictions and safety rules surrounding them. There's airspace and setbacks that go along with it. So you always first try to figure out what the long-term airfield needs are, and then look at the terminal and other areas. So this is the existing airfield. What you see here is the main direction of the airfield is sort of from the upper left-hand corner down to the lower right-hand corner. That's the 13 right and 13 left runways. And in the other direction, it's the 3-1 left and right. Runway 4 there at the bottom of your screen going to the northeast, the runway 22, that's the crosswind runway. It's of equal length to the main runway 13 right, and then you'll see a shorter and thinner runway there that's mostly for general aviation use, the smaller aircraft, and it's 5,500 feet long. And we'll talk in a minute about this intersection between the runways here, which is kind of a T intersection, which is not ideal. More about that in a minute. So this is the existing airfield. And on the next slide, you'll see that we looked at the airfield and what the needs might be for 2040 and somewhat beyond. And there's some smaller ones, some bigger ones, but you can generally group them into these 3 main categories. The first one, and anybody you talk to in aviation will tell you this, is that safety is the first priority in aviation. You're always looking for ways to make it safer or even safer. And so that's something we looked at here. The second is about the growth of your city. David just said this is a rapid growing, very large city. And as cities grow, we know that airlines typically have a bigger market and they try to serve destinations farther away, including international destinations. So you need to be ready to accommodate that when that happens. And the third need was about growth in another sense, which is aircraft movements. As passenger activity grows, so does commercial traffic and the other traffic. And as you look at all that traffic flowing through the airfield, you don't want to get to a situation where you have congestion or delay occurring, which you don't currently have. But you want to be able to accommodate that growth by 2040. And so we looked at that as well. So these are the 3 major needs. A little bit more about each of these needs. This is sort of a zoom in of what you just saw. So the terminal area is underneath the text on the left there. And this runway that aims sort of across the image to the upper right-hand corner is pointing to the northeast. It's runway 2. And so the area we're trying to improve upon, the issue we're trying to improve upon is occasionally an aircraft on the runway, like the gentleman posing there very nicely in his twin-engine aircraft on the runway, sometimes, and this is very rare, miss that stop bar there, or someone on the taxiway system gets confused and overshoots that line, and it may even end up on the runway. That's something, again, that's very rare, but we don't want that to happen. So there's other measures FAA is putting in place, but we also looked at the geometry, the layout of, is there a way to fix that and make sure nobody could, even by accident, get confused about that intersection and taxi onto the runway. So that's one of the needs. The second need, I mentioned farther destinations. This chart shows you in the red and the green line the distance that common international aircraft can reach from your existing runway. And you'll see that's pretty significant. You can get to London and into a little bit farther into Europe, depending on the exact aircraft model. We're using the Boeing 787 and the A350 here by Airbus, because those are 2 very common internationally used aircraft. And so that the red and the green line again shows you what you might be able to do today, and it varies slightly by aircraft model and airline and specific operating parameters they have, but this is general planning information from the aircraft manufacturers. And then we looked at, well, if you get more traffic, and if you want people to go to, if the airlines want people to be able to go to farther destinations like deep Latin America, farther into Europe or even Asia, what kind of runway length are we talking about? And it depends on the exact operating parameters, but it's anywhere between 9,500 feet and a little bit more than 10,000, maybe 10,700 feet is kind of the range. 10,000 seems to be a sweet spot that gets you the most bang for your buck. And you'll see in a minute why that's also a very nice number for the airfield. But you can really see what you get if you were to have a longer runway once the airlines are ready for this type of demand. So on the next slide, we're talking about this third need we mentioned, which is accommodating projected growth in terms of aircraft movements. So this is a bit busy, but the green line here shows you the forecast, the most likely forecast, the one that was approved by FAA. And we're in this left side of the graph here, which is the 20-year planning period we're looking at. You can see to the right there, sort of the 50-year look that we did back in phase 1. And you can see that if you look at the most likely forecast, that yellow box, which represent when a new closely spaced parallel runway would be needed, that you don't need that if the most likely demand happens until about 2048. Now, even in the most aggressive scenario, you don't really need it until the end of the planning period, right around 2038, 2040. But before that, you see an orange box that shows optimizing the existing runway. And even that's not needed until sometime from now, past 2035. But what that would mean, we'll show you in a minute. That's not a parallel runway, that's an enhancement to the existing runway. So the widely spaced that we previously looked at being farther out in that cloud you saw is not something that's really needed until the very far future. You can see we're talking more like the 2060s. So that runway is really not needed by today's planning standards. So a little bit more information on how we addressed these needs with our solutions, our alternatives. First, when we developed solutions and alternatives, we wanted to make sure we weren't just looking at stuff that had been brought up in the past or things that we might think of. We wanted to make sure we got outside thoughts and weren't missing anything. So we said, how do we do this? We're going to just make sure we flesh out every idea anybody might have. And we got a fantastic response. You'll see some of it in a minute. But you see here some folks in a workshop working on runway ideas. On the left is a binder we carried around. Once we had our 91 concepts, we put them in that binder. And as we evaluated them, and some were eliminated, some were modified and carried forward, we kept them in that binder and showed it to people and asked them, do you have a new idea? Is there an idea that's not in here? And so lots of people gave us feedback. We had with us in all those meetings and in that binder this image. It sort of developed over time. This is kind of a you are here, we are here chart. Yellow star started off on the left. We started with our 91 concepts. Some were eliminated. We went to the next round, and more detailed analysis took place once we got to the end. For example, when something doesn't work at all, there's no need to figure out a cost estimate on it because it just won't work. We can eliminate it early on. So that's kind of the evolution of the process we went through. And so on this next slide, you can see some of the what we call fatal flaws, things that you use to eliminate alternatives early on before you get into more detail. For example, we're trying to make sure the airport can add capacity on the airfield or in the terminal area. If somebody drew up an alternative that reduced capacity or didn't add capacity, that would not be useful. For example, if an alternative added runway intersections, that's not a good thing from a capacity and a safety perspective. FAA is, very active in trying to eliminate runway intersections, not build new ones. So these are some of the factors we used. I should mention another one, public parks. There were some folks who suggested runways entirely outside the existing property in, say, a neighborhood or a nearby park. Those alternatives were flawed out in the early rounds. On this next slide, you see a little bit more about some of the factors. So here's one we wanted to focus on a little bit more. There were quite a few options suggested that took that crosswind runway 422, which is the northeast direction, and extended it, added a parallel, or otherwise made that the main direction of the airfield. In other words, the main direction today is in the 1331 direction you saw, which was a little bit more horizontal in most of our exhibits. And this would rotate it 90 degrees. And why that's an issue is because of airspace. You'll see here in this arrow, we eliminated alternatives as we went. We actually had an exhibit that showed all the alternatives. It was hard to see because we had everything from runways off the property, as I mentioned, but also a circular runway in there, for example. So what you see here is from several rounds onward as we eliminated options. So those runways were those options that rotated the entire airport in the northeast direction were eliminated. And we know there's a lot of interest. People talk to us at the various open house events, pop-up open house events, and other meetings we had, and asked us why. And so we really delved into that. And here's one of the many exhibits of what we looked at. In the case of the northeast direction, that's the yellow arrow from SAT, San Antonio International, and Randolph to the east. That's about 11 miles due east of San Antonio International. And you can see that there is an airspace interference to the north east of San Antonio, northwest of Randolph. And this occurs, you can see on the left on departures and on the right on arrivals. And to make it a little more complicated, it happens at about the same altitude. So the controllers between both facilities have to coordinate on this, and they do, and they have an understanding between the facilities on how to do this. So today it's a very manageable situation. But if you were to rotate the entire airport in the direction of the yellow arrow and make San Antonio International completely dependent on Randolph, that would cause periods of traffic basically being shut down at San Antonio International because you can't interfere with the Randolph mission. So that would not be acceptable. So that's why those alternatives were eliminated. So where we left off, and many of you probably saw these alternatives back in March. That's right when COVID stopped us temporarily. Was with these two alternatives. They look somewhat similar at this scale, but essentially the difference between the left and the right screen is which runway do you extend. On the left, the existing runway is extended with the one on the right, the parallel runway, the closely spaced parallel runway, which is today the general aviation runway, would be extended. The issue, I mean, in 2040, both of these would work just fine. The only issue with the one on the right is that the runway extension would occur after the parallel runway would be built. And that's a bit of an issue in that you wouldn't have the flexibility to extend the runway over time in increments, justified by actual airline needs. So the one on the left is more flexible. And a little bit more about this piece over 281 here in a moment. So this is where we left off with you in March. And then, of course, COVID stopped everything. We were able to hold about 4 events. So we had pop-up open houses, we had some coffee clutch meetings, we had study advisory committee meetings. And then right before we were getting ready to go to our open house, everything came to a screeching halt. The whole study was paused in mid-March. We restarted later in the year with the technical work, did a lot of rethinking, reassessing, and got underway again. And that's why we have progress to report today. The only other thing I want to mention about COVID is that we recognize that aviation demand in the near term is, of course, dramatically different from what anybody would have thought a little bit more than a year ago. But we don't quite know yet what COVID's impacts are on long term. We do know it may be different, but not exactly how. So for now, what we're doing is working with the existing forecast, and we realize it may be slightly high. But we'll reassess that in a few months here and talk to the FAA as well about what do we do? Do we stick with this forecast? Do we adjust it a few years, but otherwise leave it be? Do we rethink the entire outlook and redo the entire forecast and tweak the planning to reflect that? So we don't know that yet, but we do know that we may be slightly high with the forecast. That's in planning terms, that's a better thing to do than to be low, because if you're low and demand is actually more aggressive than you thought it would be, then you're not ready for it. So we may be slightly high with our planning, and the things we're showing you may not be needed until a little bit later, but we'll know more in a few months when we reassess the forecast. So we talked about these needs, and here they're shown in the tops of the boxes. And at the bottom are descriptions of what the solutions are. but it's probably better to look at some graphics to talk through the solutions we've come up with. So on this next slide, you again see the existing airfield, but you'll see the yellow circle there. There is an extension of that end of the runway to get that T intersection, if you will, to not be a T intersection anymore. This is something when you're taxiing in this area, makes it very clear that the runway end moved a couple of 100 feet and it's not right on top of the other runway. There was a previous solution that also tried to solve this. We put a lot of thought into this with a lot of stakeholders and have come up with this solution as a way to improve the situation. Everybody knows that a parallel runway is better from a safety perspective and flow perspective than intersecting runways, but as long as you have intersecting runways, this is probably the best solution that we can come up with. It's been through preliminary runway safety safety risk assessment, excuse me, and this is one of the projects that we're looking at. Looking a little bit farther out in the future, in the 10 to 20 years, there's two projects. One is the biggest one here with the yellow oval. I'll just point out one other one near the terminal area. You see this angled taxiway coming off the runway towards where it says terminal area there. That is a slightly reconfigured taxiway from what's there today. That should allow aircraft to get off the runway a little bit more quickly, which increases the runway's throughput. And that does away with the need for any other, postpones the need for any other capacity improvements. The bigger project, this one in the yellow oval, that's a runway extension. It looks a little different from the one you just saw on in hot pink from where we left off in March. And the reason is that this fits nicely on the airport property. It still is a overall 10,000 foot long runway, which is what we showed you on that range chart for the aircraft going internationally. And very well gets you 10,000 feet on the property and doesn't interfere with 281. It's a big project. It's hard to see at this scale. So on this next slide, we have a bit of a blow up of it. I won't bore you with the engineering details, but just suffice it to say that we did dig into this to understand the elevations there, any potential interference with 281, how close can you get to the edge there and have sufficient setbacks, and what does that look like? So what you see here is just a snapshot of some of that engineering detail. Essentially what this would be is on airport property. The runway would stop short of 281, and it would be at an elevation where should in the 40 or 50 year time frame an extension be needed, you know, by future generations to go to future destinations with future airlines, then you would have the option to extend it further if that were ever needed. And of course, we've coordinated with TxDOT on this, and we've, as I said, done quite a bit of engineering to understand what that would look like. But that's not part of the plan. This is part of the plan. That would be another 1,250 feet on this end. You saw the short extension on the other end. Together, it makes for 10,000 feet. So that was the airfield. We're not done with the terminals yet, but we did want to give you an update. So with terminals, also let's talk about the needs, the shortcomings a little bit. On this slides, we did the same thing with terminals. There were lots of issues, and you can sort of combine them into these three main categories. First, you have to accommodate passenger demand, and we deliberately looked at high growth demand, so a little bit more aggressive than we actually think will happen. The reason for that is it's very disruptive to expand your terminal while it's in use. You know, that's just how it is at airports. So you try to not do that. You don't need to. That means you try to plan for a little bit more growth to make sure you're ready and that the things you build will last a while and that you don't have to come back in a few years later and expand or redo things. That's why we looked at high growth demand. We heard from many of you. We heard from the mayor's appointed Airport System Development Committee and others that a world-class customer experience is very important. That's what people want. Jesus has said that many times as well. That's what we're trying to accommodate. The third need is about Terminal A. We also got comments about Terminal A. It's an older building. It goes back to the 80s. It no longer meets the needs of today's aircraft and passengers. There's not enough space in it. And also behind the wall, so to speak, are various systems like electrical and sewers and all that, which also are starting to reach the end of their useful life. So a major issue that we also knew we needed to fix. On this next slide, you see the terminals in an aerial view. On the right, you see Terminal A, and on the left, there's Terminal B, and there's kind of an empty spot next to Terminal B. That's where the past terminal used to be that was demolished. You can see on the upper side of Terminal A there, the concourse, and then on the south side, you can see just how skinny that is. It's too narrow by today's standards. There's not enough concessions in A especially, but also B could use more. While the concourse on B is wider, we'll show you a little bit more about those dimensions in a moment. You still have this issue of separate security for the terminals, and if you're behind security in one terminal and you'd like to go to a restaurant in the other terminal, you can't really do that without leaving security, going across and going back through security. Obviously, that's not practical for people. So you're essentially stuck behind security on one side or the other, and there's no flexibility there. When you look at today's planning standards and you were to provide this number of gates, you would build more space. You're undersized today already by about 13%. And of course, we're looking not at today, but at 2040. So when you look at 2040, we know that you need about 12 more gates and of course, more building square footage. On this next slide, these are clearly pre-COVID slides. If you've traveled from Terminal A during peak times, you've seen this. But if you've maybe traveled once or twice a year and traveled during the off-peak periods, you may not have seen it this busy. But for significant portions of the day during the peaks, it's this busy. On the right image there at the top, that's Terminal A looking north. So on that previous image that was sort of up, that's actually the wider concourse, the wider part of the building on A, so that's the good part. The lower level, lower image there on the left is the bag claim area in Terminal A, and you can just see when a couple flights come in, everybody's standing on top of each other while they're waiting on their bags. So not the ideal situation, and we're very much aware of this and are trying to address all this. So on this next slide, you see where we left off in March with the terminals. I'll just walk through generally what we discussed back then. At the lower end of the image, you see Concourse A. It's hard to see it to scale. A little bit more about that in a minute, but Concourse A here has been completely rebuilt. So this is a proper dimension facility. The yellow means renovation because the main portion, ticketing and bag claim area of Terminal A will need renovation. Terminal B, you might wonder why would that be renovated? Well, by 2040, that'll be 30 years old. So it'll probably need some sort of renovation. But the big news on this image was a Terminal C. And you might say it was not big news, it was looked at in the past, but that's how we left it is when COVID hit, that's where you can build it. There's space to do it right. You could put the gates you need there, and that's where we left off. So we're doing some more refinement now on, okay, what do we need? What does it look like? That general image, what exactly does the new terminal look like? This is some of the technical things we're doing. On the left there for reference, you see again, terminals A and B. And you can just see how narrow A is, especially on the southern part. And what we're planning for, what we're trying to accommodate in all of our alternatives is a much more modern concourse width. The industry benchmark is 110 feet now for new concourses, quite a bit wider than what you have. If you have international service, that would widen it. So if you have international service on one side, it'd be about 120 feet. If you were to have gates and some alternatives on both sides of a concourse, it would need to be up to 140 feet wide. So quite a bit wider than what you have today. That's kind of some of the technical stuff we're doing. And on this next slide, you can see the survey results. We also have been asking, but going back to 2018, we've done 2 surveys. We've asked people at all the public meetings and pop-up events we had and on the website to let us know what you want to see in your airport. And boy, did you respond. We've seen a much stronger response than we normally see at airports. So this is great. 3,600 people, 3,600 people completed surveys that we did, and more than 700 people took the time to actually handwrite in additional comments. And you can see here some of the main categories that people were interested in. They wanted more concessions, primarily different types of food. People wanted more space. They wanted a better passenger experience, more accessibility, and other factors. And so we're continuing to collect this information, and that's one of our asks of you today. Is after this meeting, please, go to the website, fill in what you'd like to see, send us a comment. We're continuing to collect this information. So that's all going into the terminal planning that's ongoing. And like I mentioned, we don't have a terminal plan yet for you, but we wanted to show you what all we're considering currently. Some of the specific comments people gave us here, these are just some, people were very clear that they wanted to see a terminal that reflected the local character. The current terminals, even a newer Terminal B, it's nice, but it's a little sterile. It's not really, doesn't really scream San Antonio. And people told us that loud and clear. We even got very specific suggestions about what might make it better. And again, on the right, in the green cloud, world-class types of facilities, what people want. And Jesus has been saying this and making sure we hear this, as we look at options. So that's where we are in the terminal. We don't have a final image to show you because this is still in progress, but a little bit more about what's coming up in our work. This is that image we started with, but you see in the oval here on the schedule what we're doing now. So the airfield has a check mark because we're essentially done with that. At this point, we're trying to figure out what the final terminal plan is. Next is landside, so that means access roads to and from the highway, also immediately in front of the terminals, like that Terminal A problem area where it backs up. And also that means VIA's access plans. We've coordinated with VIA. We'll make sure that all our final roadway improvement plans also accommodate VIA's mass transit access plans. Next, we can't forget about the other tenants at the airport, either existing ones or potential future ones, and have to look at how they might be accommodated in the future. Then again, we'll look at the phasing. When you have a 2040 plan, that's one thing, but how do you get there in orderly phases? Who pays for what phase? How is this feasible? This all gets presented back to the committees and to council later this year in the August and September timeframe. So that's where we are with the SDP. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening to that, and we'll transition to the Q&A period.
Thank you, John. We are now going to begin the question and answer portion of this meeting. A few reminders. Please use the Q&A feature on your screen to submit your questions. We'll be focusing on questions related to the strategic development plan during this meeting. We will start by answering the questions that we received via phone or email before this meeting began, and then we'll respond to the questions that are submitted during this meeting. We may group questions together based on related topics in order to attempt to answer all questions we receive during this meeting. Now, I'm pleased to introduce our panelists who are subject matter experts. David Robbins, who you met earlier today, is Chief Development Officer for the San Antonio Airport System and oversees the Strategic Development Plan. Susan St. Cyr is Special Projects Manager for the San Antonio Airport System and is the airport's Strategic Development Plan Project Manager. Chris Anderson is Business Process Manager for the San Antonio Airport System, SDP Stakeholder Engagement Task Lead for the airport. Ryan Hall is the Airport Principal Planner for the San Antonio Airport System and is a member of the SDP project team. John Van Woensel, who just presented the SDP update to you, is the consulting team's project manager for the SDP and is Vice President and National Aviation Planning Manager for WSP. Mark Kutras is the consulting team's Deputy Project Manager for Facilities Planning and is Assistant Vice President and Senior Aviation Planner for WSP. Tracy Beach is the consulting team's Deputy Project Manager for Business and Financial Planning and is Project Manager and Senior Aviation Financial Planner for WSP. And I am the Deputy Project Manager for Stakeholder Engagement for the SDP and am the owner of AMS, a based small business. So with that, we will start our question and answer period. The first question I am going to direct to Mark Kutras. Flow at the airport is an issue. I fly typically 3 to 4 times a month. Having all traffic go through both terminals is not efficient. Most airports allow you to bypass Terminal A if you're leaving, picking up in Terminal B. Are there any plans to improve traffic flow?
Yes, since we've been working at the airport, we've actually witnessed the backups, particularly at the peak hours in the morning and at night, sometimes all the way back to the new gas station. And that is definitely part of our plan to improve this and address some of the existing issues that exist along the curved roadway that cause these problems. So that is definitely one of the projects that will be part of this to solve that issue.
Thank you, Mark. This question I'll be directing to David. Big picture, what are the plans for expansion? We are the 7th largest city, but have a small town airport. We need to be expanding and should have started this at least 5 years ago.
Okay. 5 years ago, that's what we're up to now. We're thinking about 5 years from now. We're thinking about 20 years from now, as John said, even 50 years out on the horizon through the SDP, the Strategic Development Plan. In a nutshell, it was also what we spoke about earlier in the way of development of the region. And so economically, in the way of commerce, the airport has to follow that lead and actually help to bolster that production, right? So for that, we're looking forward to the addition of another, again, back to John's slide deck, a new terminal, a combined processing facility in the interim. They extended runway from 85 to 10,000 square feet, 8,500 to 10,000 square feet, which will get us a greater range, broader market, and a way to really market the place and make it ready for the world and for the region.
Thank you, David. I'm going to ask 2 questions that are similar. As I mentioned, as we started this presentation, we would be grouping similar questions so that we have room for all the questions. There's 2 parts to the question because they came from 2 different people, and I'm going to direct this to John Van Woensel. Who specifically is responsible for airport noise management over the adjacent neighborhoods? In other words, who is responsible for departure and arrival traffic patterns? And the second question that is somewhat related to that is, how is noise considered in the SDP?
Okay, so 2 questions. The first one's about the traffic patterns. The traffic patterns are developed, the flight paths of the aircraft are developed by the FAA, and those are based on safety and aircraft destinations. The air traffic control tower then manages the traffic on those paths. Regarding noise in the SDP, Of course, there's the NEM workshops next week where noise is discussed in detail, but in the SDP, we will be looking at a 20-year noise footprint. Also, it's important to note that in any projects that come out of the SDP need to be checked for whether environmental approvals are needed for a host of potential impacts, including noise. And so the SDP, can't just be considered by itself. When you're looking at a project that might come out of the SDP, it still would be subject to further environmental checks as well. But we are looking at a 20-year contour as part of the SDP.
Thank you, John. I'm going to use this occasion to just add a reminder about questions related to the NEM. And we're focusing, as we've mentioned, on the strategic development plan. And if you have questions about the NEM, also known as the noise exposure map, we encourage you to participate in one of the NEM workshops that are coming up on February 16th, 17th, 18th, and 22nd. And that also includes people who are interested in learning more about current noise levels and noise abatement. Thank you. This question I'm also going to pose to John. Will these new plans have air traffic flying over Crown Hill Park neighborhood?
We're not suggesting any changes here to the patterns. You saw the extension is to an existing runway. Even the future parallel that might be needed past the planning period is an extension of an existing runway. So we're not looking in a 20-year period here at any changes to traffic patterns or direction of aircraft. One thing I'll mention for context is that the FAA is in a national program looking at improvements to airspace efficiency, excuse me, and that program is eventually going to also apply to San Antonio and other airports. And as part of that, they may be looking, this is probably several years from now, at efficiencies or changes in airspace, but that's not part of what we're doing, and that's probably several years out.
Thank you, John. While we're on the topic, I'm going to ask you, John, to answer one more question. I am wondering if the goal for expanding the airport means that my home will someday be removed to make room for the expansion. All the homes in my area, known as Blossom area, had sound treatment. Is it possible that our homes will be demolished after so much time, work, and money was put into these houses just a short time ago?
Yeah, I think north of the Wurzbach next to the park, if I remember right. And I think some of these questions may come from when we went around with that binder where we showed everybody the 91 original options. A lot of those were eliminated and you just saw the final plan. But some people who lived in areas where someone else might have plopped a runway or aimed it at your neighborhood, obviously that causes concern. And I remember when we had some of those early options out there, there were runways showing up there, but those were all eliminated. So as David said, we're looking at accommodating growth, but the future airfield you just saw is what we're looking at, and it does not change direction of flight paths. So no specific goal to eliminate or buy out specific neighborhoods as part of the SDP.
Thank you, John. This question is for Ryan. Are there any long-term plans in the future for connecting Terminal A and B inside of security to allow more efficient use of services? Perhaps a central food area connected to both terminals, maybe like Dallas or Portland?
Yes, precisely. As John mentioned in the presentation, we are currently doing the terminal evaluations and terminal concepts. And one of the goals of the project is to hopefully have people be able to connect between all the different concourses and terminals behind security. So that if you are connecting here at the airport, or if you want to enjoy the food and beverage that we would be building into the new program, you can much more easily do that. Also, it ended up having a better security checkpoint, more consolidated, to have a better flow throughout the entire airport.
Thanks, Ryan. So I'm going to just mention that somebody asked a question that is related to airfares, and that's something that we're not addressing because we're the strategic development plan team versus the airfare team. So if whoever posed that question, if you could be so kind as to make a note on the question and answer section, and give your name and your phone number and your email address, that would be great. We will pass that question on to the appropriate party at the airport. And just so you know, this is all confidential information. Your name will not be broadly broadcast or shown in any kind of report after this meeting. So you can feel entirely private about having your name and phone number and so forth in this chat, in the question and answer box. This is a question I'm going to pose to John. The question is, will it fit? Wondering about the additional air traffic and the noise it will create for surrounding homes and communities, and the air quality changes from all of the additional air traffic, and are there any other development sites being considered?
Okay, so it's several questions there about noise, about growth, air quality, and other sites. I'll start with the last part, the consideration of other sites. The short answer is no. As you saw in the beginning of the presentation, or maybe the questioner missed that part, that question was settled in 2018. It will fit. There's no need for another site. Regarding noise, if somebody's interested in future noise, of course, the forecast is out on the website, and you can see what future traffic will look like. Or we expect it to look like. We don't know the future 100% for sure. In terms of noise, we will run a 20-year contour to see what that looks like. The NEM that was mentioned already, the noise exposure map effort. Next week, we'll look at a 5-year future contour as well. And as I mentioned before, any kind of implementation of projects that could increase noise are always subject to environmental approval in this country under the National Environmental Policy Act. And if there were to be an increase found because of a particular project, then that process, the NEPA process, would identify mitigation measures and make available funds to do that. Regarding air quality, we're not specifically addressing this because this is not an environmental study, but I will mention that the airport is doing a number of things to address the air quality component they can control, which is the equipment on the ground and the vehicles. And so they're looking at electrifying or using alternative fuels for buses and the ground service equipment like the tugs that drive around on the air side to turn as much of that into low or zero emission vehicles. So the airport is working on that. David, who you heard earlier, has a strong background in sustainability, so that is definitely part of the airport's goal.
Thank you, John. I'm going to address this question to Mark. Is there any, or can there be, public access planned to the northern side of the planned expansion near the Wurzbach Parkway and Jones-Malzberger intersection? By public access, I am referring to passenger terminals for both commercial airlines and private hangars, as well as cargo shipping terminals.
So the north side of the airport, which has corporate aviation and some airline maintenance facilities already, there is public access to the north side of the airport. We are looking at how to allow those functions to expand in the future as needed, along with the cargo areas. But at this point, we're not looking at future passenger terminals on the north side of the airport at this time because it fits in around the existing terminal area.
Thank you, Mark. This next question is for Tracy. How have things changed in regards to the schedule and funding due to COVID?
So in terms of the schedule, as John mentioned in his presentation, and I'm assuming that this person means the schedule to the overall SDP, it was delayed just slightly, only because we had to take a moment and reset because of COVID. It was uncertain whether or not we'd be able to finish the project, but we moved forward, and that is a lot of it thanks to the CARES Act, which was funding that was authorized by Congress. About $12 billion went to airport, or $10 billion went directly to airports, and San Antonio was a recipient of some of those funds. And that helped our project to keep going in times when the airport was not and is not obtaining the revenue that it is used to attaining when passengers are a little bit higher. In terms of funding for the projects in the SDP, they will be most likely funded with a combination of both Airport Improvement Program grants, passenger facility charges or PFCs, and airport funds.
Thanks, Tracy. So someone just asked a question, and the question was, what is sense of place? And I'm going to defer that question till the later part of the next question and answer period, because there's some very talented people who will be addressing that very topic at that time. So thanks for asking that question now. I will refer this question to John. Will the extensions of the runway will the extensions of the runway ends in both the 0 to 10 and 10 to 20 year plans meet safety area requirements beyond the runway end, or will a safety device be required? And please tell me if you'd like me to read that again.
No, I think I got it. This person's asking about the safety areas, which is an area around, but also off the end of each runway, and whether those can be adequately accommodated on the airport. So if you recall, the 340-foot extension to the southeast didn't go all the way over to the fence line, so to speak. There was distance left for, excuse me, losing my voice, for a safety system known as a engineered materials arresting system, which is in use around the country and provides equivalent safety to just open space. It's essentially a crushable concrete bed that very quickly and safely decelerates aircraft that might over or undershoot the runway. On the other end, so on the end near US 281, the reason we had the runway end up so close to the edge of the property is because in that case, there would be sort of a dual use pavement. In other words, the last 1,000 feet of that pavement would be considered a safety area, depending on the operation of the runway. So in either direction, there would be adequate safety area. And this is all subject to FAA final sign-off. FAA is aware of these plans and has been on board all the way along. And I'm talking about the airport's district office when I say FAA, because there's many branches of the FAA. And of course, they will ultimately do a full review of all this and sign off on it. So there's another safety check as well to make sure this is all up to snuff.
Thanks, John. Mark, this one's for you. Have you considered space for more VIP lounges?
More space for VIP lounges. I think that's for, you mean the terminal buildings. And yes, in the terms of airline lounges, which there is presently one in Terminal B that actually is shared by American with United. And yes, each of the airlines would like to have their own club room, as we call them, for VIPs and other things. So if that's the question, yes, that'll definitely be part of the new terminal project as it progresses and be catered to the airlines and what they want to do. And there's also opportunities for the airport to have a generic one that, like American Express has their own system for people that might not be a frequent flyer.
Thanks, Mark. Mark, I'm going to ask you to answer another question. Do pilots provide input on how to pull into the terminals with their aircraft? Do the proposed alternatives seem ideal for them?
So as part of our stakeholder engagement that John mentioned, of the numerous meetings we've had with our stakeholders and technical advisory that pilots were and airlines were part of, the layouts of might be laid out in the most efficient way of entering and exiting a terminal gate by aircraft have been taken into account. In addition, we have what's available to us for planning purposes, something called AviPlan, which is a model that actually allows like a 3D model to show an aircraft entering and exiting a gate. So that confirms that it makes sure it meets the criteria and is very efficient. So yes, the terminals, and the short version is yes, the terminals will be very efficient for entering and exiting with aircraft for the pilots.
Thank you, Mark. We've had some really good questions, and I'm getting the sign saying that we are out of time. So I would just like to mention to you that if you have asked a question that we have not been able to answer at this point in time, we'll ask you if you could possibly put a name, your name and a reference to your question and your contact information to include both your email and your telephone number into the Q&A function, and we will respond to you later. Also, if you would like to submit questions or comments after the meeting, you can do so by emailing your questions to the address that's on your screen, or you can call the SDP hotline, which is 210-207-3403, and we will provide this contact information to you at the end of this meeting. We are now going to make a transition into a briefing focused on the airport's development principles related to sense of place, along with an opportunity for you to ask questions. I will now turn the meeting over to Dennis Viehmeyer, who is Manager of Construction and Development for the San Antonio International Airport. Dennis and his team will take it from here. Dennis?
Thank you, Gretchen, and thank you to everyone for joining us. I'm going to apologize in advance. I may have a spot, so if it's a little bit broken up, my apologies. Again, my name is Dennis Viehmeyer, and I'm the Manager of Construction Development for the airport. Concurrent with, but separate from the Strategic Development Plan, we are also working on development principles, including design guidelines and standards for the airport. The purpose for these principles and guidelines is to give our airport a cohesive visual appearance and provide a sense of place unique to San Antonio. Christine Rajpal with Jacobs is the consulting team's senior architect and aviation buildings delivery leader who has been leading our development principles and airport design guidelines and standards project. She will present an overview of the project, and at the end of the presentation, we welcome your feedback and questions. I will now turn it over to Christine. Christine?
Thank you, Dennis. Okay, moving into the discussion of the development principles and starting with the San Antonio Airport Design Guidelines. The goals for our discussion today is to go over what we have done to date, where we are going, and our next steps to get there. Looking at project objective, goals, and our schedule. So the what is development principles, guidelines, and standards are an established framework for designing construction of capital projects. A set criteria, providing parameters while maintaining flexibility and encouraging design, creativity, and innovation. key decision-making tools enabling effective and efficient implementation of projects, and a set of standards for development of future capital improvements. So that gives you a summary of what our principles, guidelines, and standards are. Moving on to the why, the benefits of development principles, guidelines, and standards include the following. Improved San Antonio Airport image, establishing a cohesive visual appearance, an enhanced unique sense of place, improved passenger experience, increased resource utilization, efficiency and focus, increased cost effectiveness and construction efficiencies, reduced operational and maintenance costs, enhanced capital improvement programming, and an established connection to the airport strategic development plan. So that is a summary of the reasons why we are doing the project for guidelines and standards. So just to reiterate, this is not the design of a specific project or building. Rather, we're establishing a set of values, and the words you see here will describe how the airport will look and feel. This will be done in hand with the strategic development program, and will wrap up at the same time and be available for all future projects at the airport. Looking at the airport as it stands today, you'll notice here the visual aspect appears just as it was developed, which was a series of additions and expansions with a different look and feel as each project was executed. The goals for what we're doing now are to provide a unified airport district and a distinct look and feel with a San Antonio specific sense of place and a cohesive user experience throughout the entire airport district. This is what we want to be when we grow up, or so to speak. Looking at the schedule to date, we began the visioning exercise in October of 2019, and we began with a series of visioning charrettes. We presented back to the airport leadership and moved forward with concept development through another series of charrettes at the beginning of 2020. Then as the theme lately, we went on a brief pause due to COVID in April. And throughout the summer, we began to be able to take advantage of the pause for public engagement. We had a series of presentations to leadership of the airport, to city leadership, the Airport Advisory Commission, and to the mayor. And we are right now in the midst of the community outreach, which will continue into March. Following that effort, we will begin drafting the guidelines document. And the goal is to wrap that up in June of this year so that it can be implemented through the strategic development plan. The process to date, we began with surveys, and what we found each time we've conducted a survey prior to the meetings and charrettes that you saw on the schedule before, we found very much consistency in the responses we received. So questions such as the main drivers of satisfaction, convenience, customer service, space, and ample amenities. Whether or not the city of San Antonio's identity is reflected in the airport, the consensus was that there was no clear reflection of San Antonio. And the question was asked whether the airport should reflect the identity of San Antonio. And the general overwhelming response to that question was yes, the airport is the front door to the city and should reflect San Antonio. So early on in the process, we explored similar documents at other airports, and the consistency amongst these documents are elements such as passenger typology, which is essentially just what is your target passenger segment or type of travelers that you would like the standards to be focused on, the regional identity of the area, and then a clear description of the guiding principles. So as we work through this for San Antonio, our process was to identify the passenger, identify the regional identity, and then identify the guiding principles. And all of this will be unique to San Antonio. So when we began looking at passenger typologies, the timing worked out well because the airport had just completed a study in September of 2019. And they had identified the traveler segments that you see on the left. We worked as a team to refine those. We did not eliminate any of the groups identified, but rather we consolidated them. And so the passenger typologies that will be the focus of the guidelines being developed are leisure travelers, business travelers, family travelers, assisted needs, military, and then employee and tenant components. Moving on to identifying San Antonio's regional identity. We began with an outsider's view of the area. So essentially the images you see on the screen right now are what you would see if you're not a resident or someone familiar with San Antonio. This is kind of the publicly available imagery associated with San Antonio. And then we worked through a charrette to refine this, and we reduced it down to the elements that you see on the screen now and categorized those as history, business and industry, military, an adaptive component, which is essentially the adaptive reuse elements that you see within the city, and then a vibrant family atmosphere. Moving on from there, we worked as a team to identify principles. Throughout our initial charrettes, there were many key words that kept coming up through our conversations. And as we have reviewed this presentation with subsequent groups, the key words are similar. What we have is the 15 words that you see here. And we have worked through a series of charrettes to further refine these keywords and become the backbone of the principles. So beginning with the term gateway, this is thought to be the goal of the airport. The airport can be seen as a gateway to San Antonio, as well as a gateway from San Antonio to the rest of the world. And San Antonio as a nation, words that fit that category are undiscovered, authentic, and approachable. Then when we look at common elements that will be seen throughout all of the principles, that includes technology, business, and industry. So to categorize the remaining words, art, fiesta, and cuisine are key components of the culture of San Antonio, and the culture is featured throughout the community principle. And the other remaining principles will be military, nature, and history. So just to clear up some misconceptions here, the order of these words does not mean that any are more important than others, but rather the four that have been identified as the primary pillars are selected as such because they really are what distinguishes San Antonio from other destinations. So we aren't saying any of the words are being discarded or excluded, but rather they are incorporated under specific principles and or they are consistent throughout all of the principles. So just a reminder, the four principles there are community, military, nature, and history. The outcome is, at the end of the day, the guidelines will set this up so that the airport will look and feel like these words. We then started to refine each of these principles and further develop them through imagery and through the use of keywords. What you see on the screen here is just a photograph from one of our working charrettes. You can see the amount of information that was discussed and processed. The participants were asked to bring imagery which really resonated with them individually, as well as the imagery that we brought and put up on the wall. And then we all worked to identify keywords and phrases that were the reason various sets of imagery resonated with the different participants. So the result of each of these for the four pillars are community. You can see the vibrant imagery on the right side here. Words such as cross-cultural, colorful, social and active, festive atmosphere, connection, coming together to eat, and then the business and industry component of the community. Those were the reasons that these images were resonating with the people in the room. For military, quotes such as "we honor our military," "military as a community," "import others," "aviation," "a good military mix with citizens and events," as well as our international relations to Latin America. Moving on to nature, another set of imagery here. The quotes that resonated with the team were "enjoying nature with friends," "relaxation," "the German influence of the hill country," "family time," "conservation research," and "pockets of research." And history, which is probably the most notable element for outsiders, a lot of quotes associated with this. Immigrant diversity, history is still alive. Some of our original families are still living here. Perseverance and reuse, the blending of old and new. Crossroad of 1,000-year footpaths, and the Mission Spanish heritage. So from those quotes, we worked together to establish key phrases. For community, it is felt that San Antonio is Hispanic, but also multicultural. Color as a form of celebration. As you notice from the imagery and just from looking around within the city, color and vibrancy is a predominant theme. There's also day versus night. San Antonio is very different during the day than at night. So during the day, there's work and business, and then at night, San Antonio is about coming together and celebrating. And then a very distinguishing word related to San Antonio is authentic. So the desire is to represent San Antonio in an authentic way, rather than the tendency to take a more Disneyland approach. So everything about San Antonio and community should be authentic. For military, the term order comes to mind, but more importantly, integral. Military is a priority for San Antonio, and military benefits can be seen throughout the city. There's a very prominent presence amongst the people, and that provides San Antonio with a sense of comfort. Another special element that's unique to San Antonio is military as family. People welcome the military into their homes, and San Antonio as a community responds to the nomadic nature of the military by celebrating holidays with service members and bringing them in as part of the family. When we start looking at nature, the obvious one is celebrating the river. The river is a prominent feature of San Antonio, but beyond what is commonly known, the river represents preservation and conservation, and then using nature as a connector. Nature brings people together and is a cause for celebration. Nature is a common thread that is woven through the community. And the fourth principle being history, the words old versus new. Adaptive reuse is very prevalent in San Antonio, and there's great emphasis on the juxtaposition of old and new. History is an attractor. People go to San Antonio to see the missions, and obviously the Alamo being a predominant feature. And as we look at the historical buildings in the area, there's a common theme of neutral as a backdrop. The natural beige tones from the limestone set a neutral backdrop for the color and diversity of the city that really will pop on top of the neutral backdrop. So our next steps. Community engagement is where we are today and will be for the next month, looking for feedback. So as discussed in the Q&A section, please do provide feedback on what you've seen today. Every time we've had a presentation, we incorporate those comments into the principles that we have here. So we're really looking to get feedback from anything that should be added or edited from what you see today. So the next steps will be translating the key phrases into design elements. And this is where we get a little bit beyond the common easily grasped elements here, where we have the principles and the key phrases, which we just went through, and then we develop those into architectural design elements. And so this, from a layperson's perspective, would involve the materials, the way light is used in the spaces, the way color is used in the spaces, and setting some guidelines around form, which can be important. As you've seen from a lot of the presentations, we're looking at things right now in the planning effort in 2 dimensions, but as the projects progress, they will start to develop in the 3rd dimension. So we will want the shape and the style of those buildings to have parameters. And then obviously furniture and technology requirements and guidelines will be established to be worked throughout. Looking ahead, our design team will evolve some initial concepts to encompass the visioning effort, and that helps translate the words that you see on the paper into some more visual expectations of what you can see the design vision of the airport to be. And feedback from the working sessions and engagement meetings will be used as the basis for the documentation phase. And it will culminate in production of, we use the term book, however, with this being digital format, it will be available on the website of the airport, and it will define the visioning and set the parameters for all the subsequent projects to come. And that wraps up the presentation component of the design guidelines piece. I think we're ready to move into the question and answer phase.
Thank you, Christine. We will now go to the question and answer portion of this session. Just a few reminders. Please use the question feature at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. And also, as with the previous presentation, we may group questions together based on related topics in order to attempt to answer all questions received. In addition to Christine Rajpal, I would like to introduce another member of the project team who has been working on this project and will assist with some of the questions that we received, and that's Craig Ronhell, lead designer with Jacobs. Okay, first question here, and I will direct this to Christine. It is there an opportunity at the airport to highlight our UNESCO designations, World Heritage Site, and Creative City of Gastronomy?
I would say there's absolutely an opportunity for this. The goal of the guidelines is really to establish a framework, and that allows the airport the opportunity to feature various elements of the city. So the standards themselves will not be prescriptive to dictate what is featured, but rather that elements reflecting the principles will be prevalent throughout the airport.
Thank you, Christine. This next question I will take. Will these solve the problem? I'm sorry, what specific areas of the airport do these standards apply to? Ideally, these standards and guidelines will apply to all areas of the airport. Granted, it's not going to happen overnight, and it's a process that'll take time as new projects, new facilities are being built. Ideally, though, these standards and guidelines will apply to all areas of the airport. There is another question here, and I will direct this to Christine. Will these solve the problems I experience with security and check-in?
The problems with security and check-in will be addressed through specific projects that will result from the finalization of the strategic development plan. The guidelines and standards that you see here will help support a cohesive airport experience. However, the guidelines and standards themselves are not specific projects. So the projects resulting from the development plan will be what addresses issues that exist in the airport today.
Thank you. This next question I will take. Could we integrate more community involvement into what our airport represents? There is no leadership without an involved community. In response to that, absolutely. I believe the slide that's up on your screen now has email address where we welcome your feedback and input. We've already presented this presentation to leadership and committees that represent the community. We are taking this now to these public meetings and presenting to the community. And also we have a series of meetings scheduled throughout the month with different organizations and entities that also represent the community. So absolutely, we welcome the input and feedback that we have received to date, as well as the feedback and input that we hope to receive through this meeting forum. Okay, this next one I will address to Christine. I could not get a sense of the photo at the bottom of the screen under the industry category. It appears to be a large room full of chandeliers. Is that correct?
I believe the image being referred to is actually one of a German beer hall. And the reason that image was selected was twofold. One, in that it represented the cross-cultural nature of San Antonio. And the second being that the form is very similar to the form of the existing Terminal A. So the intent is not a direct reiteration of an image such as that, but rather more about the way the space is dealt with architecturally. So the space for gathering in the middle with the dedicated program around the edges, in addition to the use of light and the use of the form. Hope that answered the question.
Thank you, Christine. This next one I'm going to direct to Craig. It seems like the keywords chosen aren't all treated the same. Why isn't cuisine as important as nature?
Yeah, it's actually a great question. There really isn't any specific hierarchy to the words that we chose. The importance of the words was making sure that they were represented and that we analyzed them in a way that would allow them to make their way to the final product and ultimately define what we've been referring to as a sense of place for San Antonio. So we tried not to lose sight of all of the key words. We just wanted to be able to group them and in order to get a better handle on how we would organize them as we move forward.
Thank you, Craig. The next question here I will take. Is there a way that local artists can display their hard work paintings to the hallway in the airport? Absolutely. In fact, while it's not really a part of the design standards, we do have an active arts and culture program, which is another division of the airport. Currently, we do have paintings hanging in our hallways. We have a sculpture going up at the entrance to our airport called Star Over Texas, which is a sculpture by a local artist named Sebastian. But absolutely, we have a very robust arts and culture program. And if you could leave your email in the chat, we'd be happy to put you in touch with that division. Next question, if Christine, can you address how long will this take?
So I presume this question is asking how long will the standards and guidelines project take, but please clarify if that's not the intent of the question. As I mentioned previously, the guidelines component is expected to wrap up in the beginning of the summer, the month of June of this year. And from that point, we will move into the standards portion of the project. So the guidelines will establish the vision, and then the standards, which is phase 2 of our efforts, will identify the more prescriptive requirements for the airports for various systems, various materials, and the things such as wayfinding and mechanical electrical systems.
This next question I'm going to ask if Craig can address. Did the community express any thoughts or concerns about environmental wellness?
So, again, we've had quite a few really intense sort of all-day meetings where a lot of these concepts have come up. The specific term environmental wellness, I don't remember if that specific term was mentioned, but regarding green initiatives and making sure that we're considering the environment, these were all discussed and ultimately will become a part of what we put together for the airport. However, if you have specific comments or thoughts about that, again, this is what we're here for today. So we'd love to hear if there's specifics that you want us to consider.
Thank you, Craig. I will take this next question. Question is, does this mean we are taking down the existing airport and building a new one that matches these existing standards? The answer to that, again, airport operates 365 a year, 7 days a week, 24 hours. As I mentioned earlier, these standards will initially be applied to any new construction, new efforts, new facilities that are being constructed, and then they'll be implemented and transitioned in as facilities are refurbished, any additions or alterations that we have coming up in future capital programs for the airport. Christine, I'll ask that you take this next question. I don't see any designs here. How does this apply to what the new terminal is going to look like?
I would say it's a good thing we don't see any designs here, because our objective here is not to actually generate designs for specific projects, but rather to establish the vision for forthcoming projects. So what we're working on now that we've identified the principles is to convert that intent into design elements that will be used by the architects and designers of future projects for the airport. So it's not intended to be a specific design, but rather a set of parameters to allow all of the design professionals that come in the future to maintain a consistency of their designs on those future projects.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question here. Will these guidelines be used for the current airport or just the new portions we have seen in the news? Okay, I think this has been alluded to in some of our previous responses. Again, as we go forward and the airport expands and new facilities are constructed, these standards will be a starting point for all the new facilities that we are constructing, particularly when we get to a new terminal facilities, any of our public facing facilities. And then over time, as things either get remodeled, refurbished, there's any additions or alterations, those items would also be, these standards would be applied to the any new projects. Okay, there is a question here, and I will try to answer this one. It's how would a private security company bid on the security needs for the new building entrance and exit of construction being done at the airport? Would they contact the construction directly? Okay, I'm not sure what new entrance or exit that is being referred to, and certainly if you can leave an email and provide more specifics on this project, if it is a project on the airport. Right now, the project that I know of that's near the entrance is the Star of Texas, which is already contracted. But would appreciate more information in that regard, and we certainly can get back to you. Okay, it appears that this is all the time we have for questions. If you have a question or had a question that wasn't answered today and you would like to be contacted directly with an answer, please provide your name, email, phone number, and a reference to the question you asked in the Q&A function on the screen, and we'll respond to you later. Also, you can also email us any questions and provide comments or feedback at SATCONSTdevelopment@sanantonio.gov. That email should be up on screen, and that's an email that comes directly to my office here. Me and the team thank you for your time, and I will turn it back over to you, Gretchen.
Thank you, Dennis and team. John, would you like to add any additional information or clarifications?
No, thank you. I think between the presentation and the Q&A, we covered it.
Thank you, John. A very sincere thank you to each of you for joining us for this meeting. We appreciate your interest, your passion, your enthusiasm, your questions, and your commitment to being informed about and engaged in planning the future of the San Antonio International Airport. As a reminder, you may submit comments or questions to the email or the phone number included in your meeting invitation. That email and hotline number are shown on the screen. Please submit comments and questions by March 1st in order to have your submission included in this meeting report. One last meeting detail. The video of this meeting will be available on the SDP website at sanantonio.gov/SATfuture on Monday, February 15th. Again, many thanks for being with us at this meeting, and we look forward to your continued involvement. Thank you.